We are going to talk today about marketing U2 in the 1990s. This is a conversation with Brian O'Neill, so hopefully you are here for that session. I'm going to introduce my boss, the @u2.com founder, who is going to be conducting the interview today. This is Mr. Matt McGee.
Thanks, Tasola. Thanks for everybody for being here. So two Philly boys sitting up on the stage in Cleveland by way of Southern California for you and Washington State for me. Thanks for being here. Brian O'Neill, it's Scott Calhoun, and he and I have been helping to plan some of these mainstream sessions for several months now. And he mentioned Brian O'Neill's name, and he said, do you recognize this name from the 1990s? And I said, yeah, I do recognize this name. I'm trying to figure out why. So I went to @U2, to our website, into our news database, and did a search, typed Brian's name in there, and sure enough, here's the printouts. Brian is quoted in stories from April 21st, 1997, right before the Pop Mart tour launched. And the second one, your name is actually on the official press release for Passengers. You remember that one?
I do.
Okay. We're gonna talk about that stuff. So it's a real thrill to have Brian here. Brian was started in publicity with the Wasserman Group, which, if you pay attention to media and publicity at all, very well-known publicity firm. 1986 you started?
I started 86, 87.
Okay, and started doing publicity for U2 right around the time of the Achtung Baby album, the Zoo TV tour, through that whole era in the 1990s, some of the side projects that they did, the Passengers album, Mission Impossible, that sort of thing, then leading into Pop and the Pop Mart tour. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got to follow around the Pop Mart tour from city to city. Did you get to do the same for Zoo TV?
For Zoo TV, I was the U.S. publicist, and I was based in Los Angeles, and I would get credentials for all the media to review the shows. And their UK press person was a gal named Regine Mollette, and she was pregnant for Pop Mart. And I had done all the Zoo TV tour, and I would send my lists into Regine, who was on the road traveling around with the band, and I would say, okay, these stations are coming, here's the photographers, and here's the journalists that are going to meet the band after the show. And so she got pregnant on the next tour, and I was thrown into the fire and traveled around.
To every show?
To every show. And it's quite an experience being in a private plane with the world's biggest rock band, and being a young publicist. It was a great experience, and to be able to connect with the national press, to get your phone calls returned because you're calling about the biggest rock band in the world is always a nice treat. And I always thought, looking back, when you see footage of the Beatles in black and white, and they're on the plane, the steps leading up to the plane, or you see the president waving on the plane, and so a lot of times that was me in that plane. And on Pop Mart, one thing we would do is, traveling around in the plane, we would arrive in a city at a private airport, and one thing that I would do is I would call the local radio station, and I would let them know when the plane was going to be arriving. And they're in the midst of a big U2 push, playing the U2 songs all day, and so they would make an announcement, and lo and behold, there'd be 1,000 fans lined up against the fence watching the plane come in for the landing. And I would also call the local TV stations, and back then we had 4 stations.
Right, per city.
Yeah,
much different.
ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. And so they would be there, they would be set up in their spot, and the MO for the band would be to, okay, the plane's going to land, we're going to go over and talk to the fans, and as Jim said, U2 was always very aware of that connection with their fans. And so Bono would, first I would come out of the plane, and it would be this.
And then you'd be like, that's not Bono.
Like a Michael Jordan commercial. And so I would come down, and I'd go over to the TV station, and I would explain to them what was going to happen, You get what we call B-roll of the band interacting with their fans. Bono would come off the plane, he would have some tea in his hand, and he would kiss the ground maybe, or go over to the fans, and they would sign some autographs, and then they would come over and do a little bump for the evening news that would go on at like 5 or 6 o'clock. U2's in town, and it would build up the hype. And U2 is always very aware of those opportunities. And so while it sounds glamorous, it was always very stressful. It's
I don't believe you.
glamorous on the outside, but it's always stressful. I mean, what if there's a breaking news story and there's, the news crews have to go somewhere else? And I remember one time we were in San Antonio, and usually they bring an on-air talent because you're going to get a chance to talk to Bono. So you'd have the roving reporter there. And in San Antonio, they just had this one camera guy, and he had no idea who U2 was, but he couldn't believe what was happening. And so he said, listen, you got to introduce these guys when they come over. And it was kind of awkward saying, okay, this is The Edge, and this is Adam and Larry and Bono. And so then he would say, okay, ask them some questions, and I would stand behind the camera, and we'd still get our footage. And so U2 is always very aware of that, and it was a great experience to be able to go out on the tour. And then when the showtime came around, we would get the photographers together and get them up to the front of the stage, which is so different now because everybody has iPhones, and there's some great photos out in the hallway of a photographer who was able to shoot like a whole show from anywhere in the stadium, whereas you couldn't really get those opportunities, back then. Right. But yeah, sure enough, so the next day there'd always be a picture of Bono and with his mouth open, and we were talking about mouth open versus mouth closed. And Bono always wondered, why would they have my mouth wide open like that? And I would explain to him that the media are telling a story about the show last night. And if your mouth is closed, it doesn't look like you're singing. When your mouth is open, that's the image that they want.
There's a little coaching going on there.
Yeah.
And he does that now even when if he's doing a still photo, he's always...
Yeah, and they're very aware of how people see the show, and the visuals are second to none, obviously. And I remember being in Ohio on the Pop Mart tour at that stadium, the Horseshoe Stadium. It's like
Columbus.
100,000 people. And Bono was always very aware of how high the stage was and how these photographers are shooting up my nose. And so he would try to move it back so they got a good shot. And he was also very aware of where the press sat to hear a show. And if you're a member of the media, going to a venue where there's 100,000 people and you're used to that sort of VIP treatment, you have to get to the point where you're going to see the show and review the show, you would want to be able to hear it. And in a stadium where there's 100,000 people, where do you put the press? And so Bono would, during sound check, we would walk around the stadium and we would find the best sounding areas, and we would try to seat the press there and for the best visual, for the best experience. And so Bono was always very aware of how that played out in the press. And so there's always a very collaborative effort on tour.
Let's go back before that. Was Achtung Baby the first work that you did with them? Was there anything before that?
Yeah, the earliest things that I did with U2, when I first started at this PR firm, I'm in college, I'm taking communications classes, and it's a dream to get a job at a PR firm, and I started at the PR firm, and this guy, Paul Wasserman, came up to me and asked me if I wanted to work on the music side. Here they had some television and entertainment. And one of the first things I did was the Rattle and Hum press kit, and I would collect the press clippings. And I always thought that it was favorable for the most part. And so my first experience was creating these scrapbooks of press clippings, and I would send them to the band, and that was my first introduction. And then there's a long period of time before Achtung Baby actually came out. I think it was like maybe almost 5 years since their previous studio album. And this big PR firm that I was working at, the partners separated, and Paul and I started this boutique PR firm. It was just the two of us. And we had this office, and I got a call one day from principal management, and they said, Bono and Edge are in town. I think they were mastering the record at A&M in LA. And they said, they want to come by. They want to come by the office. But don't tell Paul, it's a surprise. And
Don't tell Paul Wasserman.
Yeah. Okay. And I said, well, when are they coming? Well, they'll be there in like 10 minutes. And so of course, being loyal, I went into Paul's office and I said, Bono and Edge are coming. And he said, all right. And so we were at this sort of like high-rise, this Dow Jones building. It's a very corporate building in Mid-Wilshire District in Los Angeles. And so Bono and Edge came up, and Edge had his jeans with the rivets in them, and they looked very rock star-ish. And so they come into the room, and I had never met the guys before. And so Edge has this DAT player, which was, the belle of the ball back then, technology-wise.
Technology.
And so he had these. So he said, hey, where can we plug this in? And Paul Wasserman was a writer more than anything. He would sit at his manual typewriter and write press releases like the one you saw Adam write in the very beginning, all these typewritten press releases. And so he didn't have like a big hi-fi system. And so Edge said, well, I could play it through this, but you have to listen to the headphones. And Paul said, let Brian listen to it. And so Edge puts the headphones, from me to you, puts the headphones on and hits play. And the first song, Zoo Station, is not your typical intro to a song. And so Edge is staring at me, and I'm trying to maybe find the beat through this sound. And so, I listened to the whole album with Edge, and Bono talking to Paul about how we were going to present, this music to the public. And so that was my first meeting. And then, of course, all the girls were like waiting outside the door for Bono to come out and sign autographs. And then, so it started to get late, and I realized that on Wilshire Boulevard, your car would get towed after 5 o'clock. And so, where did you guys park? And so, we're just right down the street. And so, I walked down in the lobby, and they parked like 4 blocks away in a public parking spot. They paid like $5. And here they are, walking down the street with his studded pants and Bono's leather jacket, and just salt of the earth, genuine,
normal guys,
working class.
So you listen to the whole album with Edge staring at you.
The whole, yeah.
No pressure or anything, right?
No. There's some good songs on there.
Yeah. And then the album finishes, and I know what it was. Well, the first time I listened to it, I was like, "What on earth did I just hear?"
Well, yeah, and of course, I'm not a disinterested party, and I'm going to be positive, and I liked it. So,
were you a U2 fan before starting to work for the Wasserman?
I had Boyle, and I had listened to their records, but I was kind of more into like the Clash and the Who, and the Yardbirds, and sort of like mod type of British music and black music, and so I had a wide palette of taste, and so it was great. It's, how could you not?
All right. So I have a bunch of questions that we're going to hopefully get through. And we've also started getting some audience questions. We took some questions online. If anybody has questions while we're doing the interview here, Let's see, who's in the, Jessica is in the back, Tasula's in the back. We have pens and index cards there. So just feel free to run back and write down a question, and then we'll bring it up here and we'll try and work your questions in as we go. Let's talk about the theme of the conference is change and transition, and that was a time of great change for you too. They had one image in the 80s, right, the very staid and poor-faced, kind of serious kind of thing, very different in the 90s. How was that presented to you when you start the campaign?
Well, one thing that I was going to talk to Jim about earlier was how U2 has this amazing capability of surrounding themselves with talented people. Steve is one person, Catherine Owens is another, Paul McGuinness, Anton Corbin, and their tour managers. Edge has an amazing guitar tech named Dallas, a super nice guy, and so when the campaign comes around, they would automatically have these images, especially like the Anton Corbin images, which are so strong that the press love it because it's juicy, it's sexy, it's gritty, and it's something that they've never seen before. So when you come out with a campaign like Achtung Baby, all of a sudden we haven't seen the band for so long, and they have all these images that Anton took that were so strong. I remember there was this one image of the guys sitting on this black and white tiled floor with their backs together. And I think it was in Berlin maybe, and these were just great images, and even the images that are on the cover and in the inside jacket, the whole presentation is so first class that it leads the way. And one thing that Steve and I were talking about, how U2 is able to surround themselves with talented people and smart people who give them their thoughts, who give advice based on their experience in the business. But U2 is always able to filter that out and make their own decision, and it's usually the right decision.
So what were the walking orders for promoting Achtung Baby? I mean, they had just switched record labels. That was right after, was it Polygram bought Island or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. So what was the plan of attack there?
So in doing publicity for U2, it's not unlike any other band. We have a basic job that we do, and we get music to journalists is one of the first things that we do. First, like I said, the band has given you this amazing package of photos. A lot of times a publicist might have to hire a photographer. You got to get books and submit them to the band about artistic quality and how they want to present their image. But that was sort of given to us a lot of the time. And so it was our job to get music in the hands of people like Jim and Robert Hilburn, and make sure that Robert Hilburn gets an invitation to go see the band, or Jim Henke and Robert Hilburn had some of the early access to U2, and Robert Hilburn would go to Dublin and get an advance copy of the music, and so it was our job to get the music in the hands of journalists who were going to write about it. And most of the time, there was a short list of the best writers, and U2 would always want to get hooked up with the best writers. There's a certain there's a certain level of communication that somebody like Jim could have with the band versus like a student newspaper writer who's going to ask sort of these general questions. And so I think guys like Jim and Robert Hilburn can connect with the band on a different level. And it was very true that the British press and the European press and like hot press and in Ireland, they would really set the tone for the band. And it doesn't surprise me that the next big thing was picked up as being connected with the band, because they were.
So to that degree, right, your job didn't change. I mean, that's always the job of the PR folks, is to get the music into those people's hands so that they can then share the news. How, if at all, did your job change because of the change that U2 was doing in terms of their image and their sound, et cetera, during that early 90s period?
Well, it's hard to compare it to the 80s versus the 90s, because I wasn't there in the very beginning. Paul was their first U.S. press agent. He was, working with them when they came to America, when they did Rattle and Hum, and so for me, I'm sort of looking back at the 90s, and I'm sort of comparing it to today, and how the band had a certain philosophy on how their image would be presented. And back then, we didn't do any television. We didn't do, Letterman. And consequently, when Elevation came out and later on, it was just kind of a shock to me to see them on TV, because there was always this, like, we're not going to do television. That's not our medium.
It was a shock to a lot of fans, too. I mean,
Yeah,
it was very different for them to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, a U2 show, like a Zoo TV show, if you see a song of that on television,
right.
It's not like they're going to bring in the Trabants and the screens and do something, but that has changed. And also back then, the basic philosophy was the band had a lot of work to do. They had a new album, they had to, somebody had talked earlier about why the band didn't perform songs from their album at the show. And I think that sometimes there's a short window between when the album comes out and when you have to play those shows. And it's different from taking a recording in the studio and then playing it live. And I think sometimes there's you have to perform, you have to rehearse those songs that you recorded in the studio to be presented live, and sometimes it doesn't translate the same way. Certain songs are made better to be heard in live, environments. And I remember on the Pop tour, I think it was "Staring at the Sun" was a song that the band always was trying to make better. And we would record it at the live show and look at it the next day, and Bono would try to figure out how to make it better. And Adam would be rehearsing in his hotel room, live spots from the album that he would perform live, because that's like an on-the-fly type of thing. And so one story, we were in San Francisco for the early part of the Pop Mart tour, and it was a Saturday night, and the band had rented a space about this size, and we would stay in San Francisco for the Portland show. We'd go to Portland and come back. We'd go to the Pacific Northwest and come back. And so the band had time during the day to rehearse in this room, and they took it very seriously. And so it doesn't surprise me that there's always evaluating yourself and how to make it better, and those guys were really good at doing that.
We did an interview on At U2 probably 8 or 10 years or so ago with a guy named Mark Moreau from Island, and I'm going to read what he said about the switch from Island to Polygram and the muscle behind the campaign at that point. And just tell me, what your reaction is, or agree, disagree. He said, this was talking about when they switched from an independent label to the biggest label in the world. He said it was a complicated and costly thing because you were converting a band that everybody thought they knew, everybody had under their belt. They understood who U2 were and what U2 did, and U2 decided to tear it all up and start again, which is what Achtung Baby was. And he said, they gave me instructions to have fun, don't be too serious about it, go out and do something really exciting. Is that your recollection of things?
Well, I remember the people that worked at Polygram, and there was the people that had worked at Island at that time, and it was seamless in my mind. It was great to have the bigger marketing money. Island was kind of this almost like a boutique record label. And all of a sudden it was, the name changed, but nothing else really did. So there's more people from Polygram that were involved. There were some very talented people. And there was a bigger marketing muscle behind it. I think there was at that time there was a realization that, music companies are bigger and they potentially public companies, and this is an asset, and they realized that you can't fuck with U2. You can't, they have a vision of how they want it, and they're not going to listen to any record label, whether it's Island or whether it's Polygram. So it didn't really matter. It was still U2. They still had their way that they were going to do it, and it was great to have the resources of a bigger label. And so to me, that didn't really change. And over the years, I think the band is always aware that they had to get bigger. It was always, how do we get bigger? How do we manage being bigger? So I think it was a welcome transition for the band to be able to have resources to reach more people and have more people on your team.
Right. So you guys get contacted by journalists that want to do interviews. Bono will talk to anybody, right? Somebody wants to talk to Larry. What do you do? No.
Any band member could really have a super intelligent conversation and be a great read. But if you're a journalist, you want Bono. And a lot of times, Bono isn't going to be able to do every interview. Let's say he's on tour, he's got to conserve his voice. Edge is so, you could read an interview and you might not know whether Bono said it or Edge said it sometimes, because those guys are very, connected. And, Adam, a lot of times when we do interviews with the band, oftentimes it would be two members of the band. So we would have maybe, Bono and Larry, or we would have, Edge and Adam.
And that was on purpose?
It was on purpose, and look, if you're in a four-member band and it comes time to talk about your new record, you have things that you want to say. And U2 was always very, very fair. It was always very equal. And Larry and Adam had just as much to say about, the music and everything that Bono and Edge did.
Speaking of interviews, not involving Bono, the Negativland situation. For those that don't know, I think this played out throughout 1991. There was a very small, I don't know what you call, independent artist called Negativland that put out, I want to say it was like August or so of 91, a couple months right before Achtung Baby, they put out, and I remember walking to a record store and seeing this vinyl thing with big letters, U2 on the cover, in the exact font that U2 had used in the 80s. And had a tiny little picture of the U2 spy plane on the middle, and then down at the bottom, I think in tiny print, it said Negativland or something like that, the name of the band. So it was an obvious attempt to capitalize on the name, and the songs I don't remember if it was one or more, but it was this sort of sampled thing where they were using, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, with some outtakes of Casey Kasem just flipping out about, these Irish, this and that and the other, and it was just this crazy whole thing. And so Island got involved, right, and there was the lawsuit and the legal thing. Anyway, to get to where I want you to talk about it, 1992, they set up an interview with a magazine called Mondo 2000, which is a sort of subversive small magazine, and they want to interview Edge.
So
Ryan, over to you.
So there's this new cool magazine called Mondo 2000, and this editor named Joss, I think it was Joss Obrecht was the editor maybe, and I had known him. He was a talented writer. He was obviously a magazine entrepreneur, and so the band was keen on the magazine, And so we set up this interview with Edge, and it was kind of weird because 99% of the time, I would connect the journalist to the artist, and I wouldn't be on the phone. And for some reason, I ended up on the phone just patching these two guys together, and I would never interrupt and say, oh, that's not an appropriate question or anything like that. But so here these guys are talking, and Joss is interviewing Edge. And I don't know how many people know about this Negative Land thing, but they sampled music without permission. And so then the record label sort of automatically, oh, somebody sampled our music, the lawyers get involved, and a lawsuit. It's sort of like...
And U2 took a lot of flack, even though it was Island.
And it's almost like the bot lawsuit, where like a bot hears a song, and it wasn't like a personal thing. It's like Springsteen recently had this thing where some bars were playing his music, and then his record label sued the bars, and Springsteen was like, I don't want you guys to sue the bar. And so Springsteen looks good because it's not his philosophy, but it's this company that owns his publishing rights, their job to get infringers. And so here's this situation, and so there were some lawsuits that had been initiated, and then all of a sudden, this member of the band, Negative Land, chimes in on the call and says, oh, hey, Edge, this is so-and-so. Oh, by the way, your record company is suing us. And so here Edge is in this chill interview talking about his new music, and then all of a sudden here's this confrontation. And as I remember it, Edge was very human about it. He was very, hey, I didn't realize this. This is our record company, and this is sort of the way of the world. And it was a big surprise. We kind of got stitched up on that interview. And to cut to the chase, it was a potential PR situation because, here's a big band suing a little band. And, we had a writer. What we did PR-wise was we had a writer who was very knowledgeable on copyright, and she was close with the band. She was very aware of things, and we put out a document, and it was called like At What Cost, I think it was, like U2 at what, Negative Land at what cost. And it really, it took a subjective point of view of, well, if you're a young band and you're sampling music, you should get permission. And it was like, well, you guys never really even asked permission. If you would have asked, we would have said yes, which is a great answer.
Right, yeah. No lost answer right there.
So that's what happened. And so we tried to distribute to the press a document that explained what had happened, because there was the Mondo article, and there was a conversation that happened between like 3 or 4 people, but there's a legion of U2 fans, and there's a legion of artists who didn't know what happened, and so we tried to explain it. And there was a girl named Lisa Derrick who had written this article, and it was very well written.
The phone call was sabotage. I mean, Edge didn't know that. Yeah, there was the guy from the magazine, but he had the 2 guys from Negative Land also doing the interview, and it wasn't billed as that going in. There was no knowledge of that, and so when you're on the call and you hear this all of a sudden, if I'm you, I have to change my underwear at that point. Like, oh my God, what is going on here? Are you
well, no, but I knew that as soon as we hung up the phone, it was going to ring again right away. And, look, it wasn't, there's nothing I could have done about it. It could have happened, in any situation. He could have been confronted at a show and say, hey, what happened? But, here is, the best answer was, hey, look, we would have given you guys the sample if you had only asked for it. So it went away.
Yeah, it did.
A PR slogan that we have is "Make it go away." So we tried to make it go away.
For those that want to learn more or hear that, the actual audio of that phone call is on the internet. Dan Elliott's site, what is it? U2interviews.com or something like that? I think it's U2 Interview or interviews.com, and you can search through and look for 1992 or whatever it is. And the whole audio, the guys from Negativland, 5 or 6 years ago actually sent it to a friend of ours that has this site. You can hear and Edge handled it really as,
He could have said piss off and hung up.
yeah, just hung up the phone. But I mean, he handled it really as good as you could expect. So let's talk about the Zoo TV tour a little bit. We still have to get through the 90s, I guess. The celebrity culture surrounding the Zoo TV. Naomi Campbell, Helena Christensen, all of the models and Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. How does that change your job?
After each U2 show, there's usually, like a meet and greet. They have fans and friends that they want to say hello to in each city. New York and LA are usually much bigger events. And when Bono has like, he's got a great list of friends that call him, can I come out to the show? And when they're on tour, usually after the show, after the meet and greet that's at the venue, there's usually, a gathering at the hotel. And most of the time it would be in, Bono's room, which is like the size of a third world country and a penthouse. And so oftentimes after the show, inevitably you'd see a slew of Winona Ryder and Edge. Adam was dating Naomi Campbell, and so she would bring her model friends, and I think it's very rock star-ish, They get the top name models, whereas, I'm sure that, Justin Bieber and Coldplay, and they all have models that come back to their shows. It just so happened that there was a high visibility of model factor.
And there was PR surrounding that though too, right? Bono was on the cover of Vogue. Was that the kind of thing that you're thinking this plays into the image and let's play this up?
Bono, I think Bono believed that, and it's a way to infiltrate other media and get new fans. And Bono, the band has always had the top, like these wonderful designers. Some of the leather jackets, the stuff that they have at the Rock Hall, they had these designers and talented people in fashion, and so it made sense. Maybe not to some fans, but inevitably, even if you have Helena Christensen and these amazing models in your room, you think sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I told Jim this one story when I was on the Pop Mart tour. It was the beginning of the tour, and we were in San Francisco, and the tour had opened, and part of my job was to get all the national newspapers. At the time, newspapers were like real. You want to see a picture on the front page, and the press would come from all over the country, from Cleveland, from Chicago, from Philly, from Dallas. They would all come to the opening of the tour. And inevitably, it would be on the front page of every newspaper. And so we were in San Francisco, and it was like a Saturday night, and I'm looking at my watch, and we're in Bono's room, and it's like 5 a.m. And there's a whole bunch of people there, and I'm wondering, like, okay, I got to get out of here. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, and so I went back to my room, and then I thought, well, the newsstand's going to open, and all the Sunday papers are going to come out, and so I want to see all these Sunday newspapers with, the band on the cover. And my job was to get all the newspapers, the reviews the next morning, and I would make 5 copies. I would get 5 or 6 copies of every newspaper. And the Sunday papers are big and thick. And I would get all the press clippings, and I would go to each room number, and I would put them under their hotel door, so that when they woke up, they were able to read all the reviews. And so here it was Sunday morning, and I go to the newsstand, Hotlings, which is the big international newsstand in San Francisco, and I'm carrying the biggest pile of newspapers from, my knees to my chin. And I go, I'm in like a t-shirt and like flip-flops, I think, and God, I hope nobody sees me. And I'm in the lobby, and everybody from Bono's room had come down into the lobby. And, hey, Brian, what are you doing? I was like, I got these newspapers here. What are you guys doing in the lobby? They said, well, we're going to church. And they were going to church on Sunday morning to this big cathedral church in San Francisco. And that's when I knew, okay, this is not about drugs and drinking and debauchery. They're genuinely and sincerely salt of the earth people. They're going to go to church, they're going to bring their model friends and everybody else who's maybe doing coke in the bathroom or whatever to church and impose their ways on their friends. So that's when I knew that they're really good people.
So they read their press clippings then, is what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. Some people don't, but yeah, for sure. Everything.
Yeah.
Down to the details.
I'm being told my mic isn't working. Do we want to get the other one because it's red, so I'm guessing the battery has died? Yeah. So, in any case, that gives us a chance to get some water. And so we have some questions that we'll get to. I'll trade you this one.
And if you folks have, this one's not on either. Make sure.
They're pressing that.
Got it, yeah. If you have questions, since we're using this mic for Matt now, raise your hands and I'll come around to you with a card. You can write it out for us.
Yeah. I think they have batteries in the back for that.
Okay, so one other thing from the Zoo TV era that I want to ask you about, and I'm not sure how involved you were in this, and if you weren't, then we'll just move on. So just tell me. The tapes were stolen. The Achtung Baby tapes. Like 3.5 hours worth of stuff was put on vinyl first and then on CD. I bet a lot of the people in the audience own, it's called Salome, right? Raise your hand, do you own Salome? Look at this. Oh my gosh, what a bunch of thieves you are. Yeah, me too, right? So, and there was quite a PR campaign against that. There was a May 1991 article said, news of the bootleg hasn't gone over well with U2 or Island Records, which took out a full-page ad in the British pop publication Music Week, warning record stores that the label will take legal proceedings against anyone selling the bootlegs. Island General Manager Andy Allen added, we take the same position here that our counterparts have in England. We'll vigorously prosecute. Were you aware of all this going on in the lead up to the album? Well, apparently there's some stuff stolen from the studio, and there was a long period of time before anybody heard new U2 music, really. And so I think that there was this insatiable appetite, just like there is now for a song that's leaked, on the internet or through file sharing networks. And this is sort of like the earliest, way that things like that would get out into the public. They would either be stolen or, one of the recording engineers would share something with somebody that they shouldn't. And then, but at the time, U2 had a lot of songs that they had to narrow down for that album. And so there was this big group of songs, and, it got out. And if you're Paul McGuinness, if you're the band, if you're the record label, you want to protect your investment. And so there wasn't really any spin. It was like a business decision that they had to do. They had to let retailers know that, this is not, the U2's product. And it doesn't surprise me, even to this day, Paul McGuinness has a very strong position on, giving away music for free and people getting music for free and getting access to music for free. And so it doesn't surprise me that they were pissed, even angry that, unfinished work got out. If you're a fan, you love it.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, if you're a fan, you love it, and the byproduct of it all is hype, is build-up. And, you know, when you hear about songs being leaked, oftentimes it's not leaked. Well, it's leaked, but it's intentionally leaked. And that wasn't the case. This was something that was really, like, stolen and...
Or left behind, or whatever it was.
Yeah, it was great for fans, obviously.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. During all this time that you were doing the PR and involved in the marketing, all that sort of stuff, this is when the internet starts to get popular. I got online in 1994. There was U2 fans on CompuServe, on AOL. There was the big wire mailing list. Island Records had Island Records Co. UK, one of the first record labels to actually have a website. How does that influence, or how did that influence what you were doing at the time?
Well, when you're on tour with a band, and you have to set up like an ISDN line or a DSL line, and you're hardwired backstage. There's no Wi-Fi. It just makes things incredibly easier. It makes your job easier. It makes distributing information easier, where you can post it and people can go see it, rather than having to fax it to a million people. And so I think to that end, the technology made things easier. It is very true. U2 is a band that technology has advanced incredibly through the span of their career, and bands are always confronted with how to go with that change. From my point of view, it just made things incredibly easier when you can access technology, when you're backstage and you can get onto a wireless, and it was.
Was it ever a topic of conversation when you're doing promotion stuff? Was there how aware was the band and Paul McGuinness about this?
I remember there wasn't an immediate embrace of things, but I think who was like building websites back then? I think it kind of started. It started off, and if you're a band, you're going to be a little bit guarded over embracing that. I think one of the early versions of some of the band's websites was done by Adam's brother, maybe.
Yeah, he's and still involved as well. Was involved until Live Nation.
And so he was very savvy, and I think philosophies change over what kind of content you want to present on your website. I think at one point, U2 tried to put like their whole entire history with like a timeline, and that's just become so bloated, and I think you've seen different websites, how they're evolved with the technology.
So you guys were aware of it in the 90s. It just wasn't a huge priority at the time. It was so new. There were,
to tell you the truth, I was actually doing publicity for Yahoo when before they went public. And so here we have this little boutique PR firm, and we have U2 and INXS and Depeche Mode and Bon Jovi and Tom Petty, and so big rock stars. But we also had Paul Wasserman handled Jack Nicholson and Dennis Hopper, and so we had this film history. And so somebody from 20th Century Fox went to be employee number 14 at Yahoo, and they hired us to do their publicity and launch these vertical campaigns for their technology groups. And so U2 was aware of that, and I think it is like now where there's a wait and see sometimes with technology, and when you're a big rock band, how do you use it the best way to benefit your fans and the press and people who want to access your music? And so I think back then it was like, okay, let's see how we can use this. For me working, it just made things easier.
Okay. Let's skip forward a little bit. The Passengers album. did Edge sit 3 feet away from you and let you listen to it?
No. You know, it was one of those products that, you know, it wasn't like the band was had a physical presence. It wasn't like they were on tour. And so that was more of a just get passengers into the hands of music writers who will write about it. And so that was the main function there.
Let me read you another quote from when we talked to Mark Moreau at the label. He said, this was, talking about Passengers, this was not a U2 record. It was a Brian Eno, Edge, Adam, Larry Bono project, and that's very distinct from a U2 project. It was a very separate thing, and I was very, very, very strict on trying to stop this from being perceived by everybody as a U2 album. That's your recollection?
To me, it was a Brian Eno album more than anything from the very beginning. It's you know, I looked at it more like that, where U2 participated in his album more than it was a U2 album. But if you're a record company, you want product, you know, in the mix. So I'm kind of surprised that, you know, Mark wanted a U2 record probably, and this is what he got, and he had to deal with it.
Oh yeah, and right, exactly. So, yeah, and we all know the history of what happened to Passengers. I mean, I actually saw it in the U2 bin at the record store, though, and they, even though they were told not to put a U2 label on it, some of the places did that. Pop and Pop Mart. What the heck happened to the Pop album being delayed so much? How did it impact you on the PR side? You guys, I mean, there was going to be an enormous PR push for this, right?
Yeah, and you know, Steve pointed out to me that the band was always making decisions, sometimes last-minute decisions, and I think, you know, like the name for the record was, you know, wasn't something that was etched in stone for a long time before it came out, and so there wasn't this product that people could sort of market and go out with. And I remember even when the tour started, it was always changing. It was always a way to, okay, how can we present this big material? And, you know, look, the olive and the lemon, this was all uncharted territory. You know, even the Rolling Stones, who had this massive stage, like this, you know, whatever it was, yeah, but it was stagnant. It was one piece. You know, it was held up by beams and girders, and then there was a facade put on it to look like a stage. This was like a real interactive thing. And
what, you mean nobody had the idea to get inside a lemon and drive it out to the middle of the crowd?
There's definitely Did you see Fall Out Boy on, what was it, like Letterman, and they brought out Harry Shearer, and they had Harry Shearer in the pod, and the pod wouldn't open.
Oh no.
And it was a very Spinal Tap moment. There was some of that, I think.
Very much so. The tour, I was at opening night. Who was at opening night in Las Vegas? So about 5 or 10 folks. That was not the best they've ever played. You know, and it got some pretty bad reviews. Maybe not bad, lukewarm maybe, people saying that they didn't seem prepared. And now you're telling us that it's your job to correct press clippings. And so obviously they're aware of the reaction to that. Yeah,
there's a lot of tumult at that time. Being in Vegas for a couple of weeks, you're rehearsing with a lot of these, you know, big, huge moving parts, and, you know, things were arriving late, and like stage parts, and here we had Bono in the desert for a couple of weeks. I think he got that Sinatra desert throat, and so, you know, you can't change how the press are going to perceive. You can only, you know, invite them to review it. And
so what was it like the morning after?
Yeah, it's Vegas. you realize that, okay, this is the beginning of the tour. It's going to get better. There's positivity. It's always like that. There's ways like, okay, how are we gonna make this better? I think there was some of that, and I think there was a sort of a more rehearsing of how do we make this better, and then pop went on to international territories, and it definitely got better, and so I think that was just like an early stage. Sometimes bands will, go up to like Canada and do like an opening show because they know that everybody's not going to go to Canada, and then they'll go to LA. So they get that little rehearsal thing out of the way. But they were very vulnerable. Everybody was going to Vegas. It's easy to get to Vegas. All the press were there from the whole country.
Did it make your job more difficult because it was received the way it was?
Not really. Like I said, it's always, it seems glamorous on the outside, but it's a lot of work. Even though you're in a private plane, traveling around from city to city, there's still a ton of work to get material to the press and to make sure that a band like U2, who has interest from a broad spectrum of press, can get to the show, and they could access information, they could get photos. And so a lot of that work is just distributing the information, which is so much easier now with the internet.
So I think we have about 15 minutes or so to go, if my timing is correct. And we do have questions that came in online and questions here. Lauren, as long as we're on the subject of pop, Lauren asked this question. She says, I think it's a she, I'm not sure. I would like to know, why didn't U2 and Polygram/Universal try to market the pop album differently? I feel that sales of pop suffered from a poor marketing campaign, it's your fault, which contributed to the general public's failure to embrace the pop album, especially here in the U.S. What was the strategy for promoting pop?
Strategy for promoting pop. From a PR point of view, it's up to the press, to interpret the artistry. And a lot of times, it wouldn't necessarily matter what I said. I could add adjectives and present it however I want to. But at the end of the day, the press is going to evaluate the body of work themselves. And you have pop, you have the music, you have the stage. I can't spin that. It is what it is. And so, who asked that question?
Lauren. It's an online question. So
I was going to say, how would Lauren, what would be an idea that you could do that might change it? I saw that the Muhammad Ali hooded silk robe that Bono wore for the Pop Mart tour, and one thing that the band was conscious of was that connection with their fans. And so here was this crazy idea to move through the whole stadium, like a boxer, and the possibility that somebody could grab you or anything like that. But Bono really wanted to make that connection. And when I saw that robe from the Hall of Fame, I thought, what else could the band do? They're making themselves available. They're vulnerable in a lot of ways. And so there's only so much you can do to sort of spin it. At the end of the day, there's some really good songs, on pop. I don't know if the band could have selected different ones or came up with a different title that maybe might have marketed it differently. Pop has a certain connotation to it. I think the band was aware of that, and that was their decision. So I wouldn't suggest, changing the name of the album or that wasn't my role. It was always very, I trust the artistry.
Phil Kushner asks, were you privy to the band originally wanting to name Achtung Baby Adam with a naked picture of him on the cover and the decision not to?
Yeah, there's we had a photo of Adam with you know,
In all his glory.
in all his glory, and I remember being told by principal management to not distribute that photo. And it was part of this whole group of photos, and we did have to take that one out. I don't think that was serious. I don't think that was going to be a serious name for it. But when you know, when Anton took that shot, and it was a very it was a strong image. It had like a red, you know, tone to it, and it was like very filtered, and probably just the guys having fun.
How does, there's no name on this one, how does U2's social and political activism influence their PR?
You know, that's an interesting question that somebody asked Jim earlier, and you know, I think Bono's very aware of how what you do as a rock star could influence your fans. And if you take a political position, you could easily alienate fans. And whether it's you know, being partisan or taking a position, a political position, I think you're vulnerable in that way. In the case of U2, I think that the band is very aware of when they got to a certain level of influence, and they had a certain amount of fans around the world. I think Bono realized that how important it is to be able to use that to make a change and to make a difference. And you know, somebody like Larry would always be very aware of that role and how far Bono went out on that, you know, plank. And I think what the band has done with like Red Hot and Blue and over the years, I think Bono has used his position as a rock star as best that he can. And I really admire it because you know, other artists can do that and they choose not to because they realize how it can affect the perception of your music. And I think that it takes a confident, you know, band to be able to put themselves out there and, you know, attach their music to a cause. And I think it's made a difference. I could see how a purist might not like that Bono. They like this Bono. They like this band. But you can't ignore how you can make a change in the world in a positive way. So, you know, even going back to writing songs, like Jim said, that can influence people, why not do something that's real? You know, it's a natural evolution for somebody like Bono, I think.
This is a good one, and again, I don't think there's a name on it. You mentioned that U2 refused TV appearances in the 90s because it wasn't their medium. Were there other expectations people had or requests that came in from a PR perspective that you had to decline for image purposes? What were they? Why did you have to decline them?
Well,
stuff I didn't do?
Paul Wasserman, who was a publicist, you know, for a long time, he handled Bob Dylan and Paul Simon, and he was kind of known in the industry as Dr. No. And the goal was to connect the band with the widest points of media distribution that we could. Because when you have a campaign for an album and you realize that there's a certain amount of hours in a day and the band has to rehearse to perform, and you know, there's other things that are going on, the band can only do a certain amount of interviews. Let's say, you know, Bono can't talk to every media outlet in the world. And so what we would try to do would pick the biggest ones. A cover of Rolling Stone magazine, the LA Times, Associated Press, the Chicago Tribune, the Philadelphia Inquirer. These were newspaper outlets that had the widest points of syndication. The Philadelphia Inquirer was like a Knight Ridder paper, so it would syndicate to all the Knight Ridder papers, Associated Press and Chicago Tribune Newswire. And so things like that, we would try to do interviews that would have the most impact. And you're able to get your message out in a way that is going to get picked up. Things are so different now with blogs and newspapers being less influential. Like if you do an interview with like Pitchfork, it would probably have a bigger impact than Associated Press, which could go to hundreds of newspapers. So at that time, and I was trying to answer the question, I think, but bands would try, like now they would try to get on the morning show. They would, Letterman and Good Morning America. That wasn't even something that U2 considered.
Right. There was a question here about U2's lack of activity in social media, which kind of plays into what you were just talking about. We at U2 have I think it's now 10-year standing interview request in with Regine's agency that we want to interview somebody in the band. I'm of the opinion that eventually they will have to do that because it's harder to reach people, isn't it, nowadays, right? I mean, at some point you talk, now you might go to a Pitchfork. Like going out to the LA Times or Rolling Stone magazine does not have the same PR effect that it had 10, 20 years ago. Is that accurate to say?
Now there's a big philosophy now of the best way to succeed in the music business is to connect with your fans and to have that relationship, how valuable that relationship is. And it's going to be interesting to see how they approach that with this new record. Their manager is, Paul is he's a very strong position on how, for example, internet service providers should look after piracy. And in the past, I don't think that the band has given away music for free. That might be a decision that they have to make, whether they're going to give away a song for free. Communicating with their fans, I would think, would be a #1 priority. And the value of social networking amongst the fans, who are going to be the most active in tweeting and posting, I think you guys are looking good for the next campaign.
Yeah, well, to a degree, I mean, the fans become, sort of a alternative PR for them, right?
Yeah.
We promote it to our audience, and they promote it to their friends, et cetera, et cetera. It's a totally different.
I would think that there's probably a certain philosophy of, well, if a fan is in a fan club and they're that passionate about a band that they'll read the Rolling Stone article. They'll read the magazine articles. It doesn't necessarily have to be with the fanzine or the website. One thing that U2 did with fans over the years was they had their own magazine, Propaganda.
Used to. Right.
And one thing that we did, I would get every issue of Propaganda and I would mail it to the press. And it was a great tool for me, and some of the press, loved it. I think I have, here's an old version of one, let's see.
Good times.
So this is a Pop Mart Propaganda, and so it's a way for the band. If let's say that you have 10 great images and live photos, the local newspaper who reviews your show can only do a certain amount. But this was a great tool for me as a publicist. Sometimes I would make suggestions over, on what the press were interested in, And some of these are great. Some of the photos from Pop Mart are really good. So now you can...
A relic.
Now you can get it online.
It's a relic.
It's a blog, right?
Exactly, yeah.
This would be a blog.
Right.
Why print something?
Right, exactly. And so they stop. I think we're down to a couple minutes. Are there questions in the audience? Do we have the microphone? There are questions in the audience. Lori Joe has a question over here. Jessica, you want to... I think we're supposed to wrap up soon, but this is too fun.
Hi. So with the release of the U22 fan club issue that I'm sure you've heard about, when you brought that out, it kind of made me think, do you see there being a transition back to sending actual physical things out to fans versus online? Because, you know, we like that stuff. We like to be able to look through books. Maybe the young teenagers don't get that, but we do.
It's like stamp collecting. Vinyl, you know, fans love vinyl, and I think there's a big little groundswell amongst bands now to make vinyl. I think with like Kickstarter and Pledge Music and these direct-to-fan funding campaigns, bands come up with really cool ideas for products. You know, I know this one band from Memphis called Stein Nicey, and they paint bottle caps. They're little bottle caps, and they sell them at their show for like $1. And if you want to get an advance copy of the CD and the vinyl and the bottle cap, then you pledge $15 and you get all that stuff. And it wouldn't surprise me if U2 realizes the value of that, and they still continue to make cool things for fans. They always have, from B-sides and singles. I think it's got to be something that you do now for fans, is give them that extra cool thing. Right. Sometimes it's meet the band backstage, or have dinner with the band. When you get to a band that's the level of U2, some of those personal things you can't offer as like an independent band. I'm working with a band now, and if you pledge $15 to get their CD, they'll write you a note to thank you. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine? No, I can't imagine. Not going to happen. But sorry. But I can imagine Larry coming up with an idea to give something cool to the fans, whether it's a T-shirt or a ring or something.
Another one? Go ahead.
So you mentioned how the advancement of technology, social media, et cetera, has made your job easier. Aside from issues like music piracy, which is an obvious one, how has advancing technology made your job more difficult?
Everybody gets it at the same time. Whereas before, you might be dealing with one person who has some information, and you're able to, let's say that it's not 100% accurate. I'm working with a band now. They're a duo, and they have a 6-year-old girl, and they travel around in an Airstream trailer. And they're not married, but the press keeps saying that they're married. And so I have to go out and tell each individual outlet they're not married. When you get information that gets out everywhere, it's hard to get to that one person to get them to correct it. So I think that's one hurdle in getting information out. But at the same time, if you're the origin, if you're the point of origin of the information, and you are the one who is putting out the correct information, it's like Wikipedia, where journalists go right to Wikipedia, whether it's right or wrong. Like, who wrote that? Any fan could have written that, but they take it as the gospel. And so, one thing I would do is go to Wikipedia and change that first, because I know that people are going to go there as a resource. So when I'm confronted with those situations, that's one way to fix it. When it's everywhere so quickly, you know, it's a double-edged sword. You know, it can help you, it can hurt you.
I think we have time for one more. Last one.
All right. I was impressed with, I wonder what you thought, two-part question, with David Bowie's secrecy of his latest album. I wonder what you thought about that, and if you thought U2 could or should pull off the same thing with like a massive reinvention for the next one.
You know, I talked to a lot of magazine editors, and some of them still can't believe that Bowie is towing that line. And I was at South by Southwest, and everybody was thinking that, okay, Bowie's going to do something. And his manager is towing the line for Bowie, who said, I'm not going to perform. I'm not going to perform on TV. I'm not going to do this. And you sort of wonder from the publicist, okay, well, they're waiting for that like week-long, you know, gig on Letterman where the mystery, the penchant to hear Bowie has built up so much that he's going to do it, and it's going to be big publicity. Oh, Bowie finally did, it'll be headlines, you know, Bowie on television. And it does surprise me that he can get away with that. It's gotta, his record company, his manager has got to think that it's not helping his album sales. And, you know, certain things like that, I think old school bands, you know, like Bob Dylan, if he comes out with a new record, he's going to do a certain amount of things, and he's just, that's it. And you get what you get. As my 6-year-old says, you get what you get and you don't get upset. And so, you know, if U2 comes out with a new record, maybe they'll be on TV, maybe they won't. You know, maybe they'll do certain things, maybe they won't. And, you know, you gotta hope that they feel like they're doing the right thing integrity-wise. And, you know, U2 has always tried to get bigger. It wouldn't surprise me if they make themselves more available than they ever had. But sometimes holding a little bit back and keeping a little bit of mystery is kind of interesting. You know, I'm kind of interested in like, okay, why is David Bowie not on television? So it's kind of interesting, but we'll see what these guys do if they come out with a record before 2020.
Who knows? 50-50 odds. Are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter, Brian O'Neill.
All no hyphens or anything? Okay, so we can I didn't put it up there. I should put it up there.
Yeah, no apostrophe, just
Okay. Brian O'Neill. So we can find you there for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much. Let's give a big round of applause to Brian.